Hi, good morning, everyone. So yesterday we have discussed about this authentication and authorization. So let us dig into more, and then we will see a different examples on how to different mechanisms in order to authenticate to your Kubernetes cluster. So yesterday we have seen like how to authenticate to your Kubernetes cluster using certificates, right? So today let us try to understand keep like token based authentication, what how a token will be generated, who will generate it, and how to utilize that particular token in order to authenticate to your Kubernetes cluster. So before that, again, I just want to recall the topic which we have discussed about authorization. So we are using RBAC, rollback access control, which is nothing but a role will be assigned to a specific user or a group or a service account. Okay, so this is how we will be managing the authorization to our Kubernetes cluster. What does that mean actually? So you have so many objects or resources which are created or will be created on your Kubernetes cluster, right? And then on this particular resources or the objects, you have to perform some actions, some operations. It can be you will try to create a pod, you will try to fetch the pod related information, or you will try to delete the pod, or you will try to list all the resources, you will try to update the pod, or you will try to edit the pod, or you will try to exit into the pod. So there will be so many things, not only pod, I'm talking about other resources as well. Okay, resource in the sense object as well, which you talk about. So we are trying to add a rule in the role or a cluster role, whatever it is. Role in the sense will be applied only to that particular namespace where you will try to create that particular role. In which namespace you will try to create a role, in that particular namespace only it will get restricted. Whereas cluster role in the sense, it is for entire cluster. It doesn't bother about namespaces and all. If you say that this user has to fetch the pod details, he has to create the pod, he can
Hello.
create in all the namespaces. Okay, it is not bounded to.
Hello.
Yes. So what are the objects you try to create? You can perform some actions. Actions in the sense, technically it is called as verbs. Means create, get, delete, or list. Okay. Now this particular role, let's say if I create a cluster role, that cluster role will be allocated to all the namespaces. It is not bounded to a specific namespace, which means that I can create a pod in all the namespaces, not in a specific namespace. If you try to assign a role, then it is bounded to a specific namespace. That's it, as simple as it is. Okay. Now this is where you will define your actions and on which particular object you want to perform. Okay, so that's where you will try to declare it. Okay, so where you will try to declare it, either in the roles or a cluster role. Now in order to apply this particular role or a cluster role to a specific user or a group or a service account like token based authentication, we will either declare in the role binding if it is a role specific, or cluster role binding, right? So that's where we have seen what is this cluster role and cluster role binding. In the cluster role and the cluster role binding and the cluster role binding. So what we will try to do is nothing but we will declare like this, right? Let me show you one example. Yes. So if you see the example over here, this we already know, right? In the role, we are trying to define what in to which resource, what actions you want to perform. That's what we are saying. Additionally, we have to tell what is the API group for that particular resource. Okay. If you want to add more rules, let's say this is the rule which is applied to the pod. Let's say in the deployment, I don't want these actions as well. He just need to fetch the data. That's it. Get or list. That's it. He should not create anything, or he should not update anything, or he should not do any patchwork on that particular object. Then I need to create another section, and I need to define what is the API group and the resources, and then I need to tell what kind of verbs, like what are the actions you want to perform. Okay, so this is what we have discussed yesterday. Star in the sense, if you want to perform all the actions of that particular resource, then we have to define star. Why this topic is important? Because in any exam of CKA or CKAD or CKS, you'll get a question from here, one or two questions at least. Okay, so and role binding is something where you are saying that this role should be applied to someone. Who is that? Either user or a group or service account. Okay, service account in the sense token based authentication. User and group are nothing but username password based authentication or certificate based authentication. Okay, so role reference, you will tell which role you want to apply, and subject is nothing but where you will declare your user or a group to apply with. Okay, so this is all about your declaring your role and cluster role binding. Okay, so if you want to see in the official documentation as well, so let me try to open that. You can see this official document which is talking about this RBAC authorization. If you scroll down, whatever we have discussed, it is trying to explain the same thing. Role example. Okay, so cluster role example is used to grant same permissions as a role because cluster role is a cluster scoped. It can also be used them to grant access to. Okay, so which means that cluster roles is not only for the objects, it is also if you want to give access to the nodes to fetch the data of your node details information, health check, okay, namespaces, everything will be used by your cluster role. Role is only to bounded to a specific namespace. That is what they are trying to explain in the documentation as well. Okay, so this is one of the example for cluster role. You can see everything is same. If you try to look at your role and cluster role, all the parameters are same under the rules. Okay, if you try to declare like this, it is for entire namespaces. No need to write a namespace parameter here. Okay, why? Because it is for the entire cluster. But when you try to create a role, we have to specify on which namespace you want to create. If you don't specify anything, in which namespace you are trying to execute a command, in that namespace it will get created based on your user. Okay. Now role binding and cluster role binding. Role binding in the sense granting permissions to define in a role to a user or a set of users. Simple. I want to allocate this particular role or a cluster role to a user or a group or a service account, then we will declare a role binding, a cluster role binding. So again, cluster role binding is for the entire cluster. Okay, so and then role binding may refer to any role in the same namespace. Alternatively, a role binding can refer to a cluster role and a binding the cluster role to a namespaces on the role binding. Okay, so what does it mean in the sense? For role binding, you can refer a cluster role as well, and you can bind a cluster role to the role binding as well. Okay, so this is possible. We will see these combinations. Okay, so later in the session, cross permissions as well. So now role binding, you can see the example over here. So we already discussed this. I don't want to reiterate again on the same topic. Okay, so this is also done. So this is how it is. Okay, so aggregated cluster role, we don't want to do that right now. Okay, anyway, in the exam you need to go to this particular documentation and you have to take the example and modify according to that particular requirement. Okay, so that's the one thing we have to remember. Now let's go and see the another example related to token based authentication. So yesterday we have created this user in order to authenticate with certificate based authentication, right? So when you execute kubectl config view, so these are the user which we have created yesterday with certificate based authentication. Now let us see what is a token based authentication, and then we can discuss about username password based authentication. So in this, if you go back to this particular documentation, you can try to open this service account based authentication. Okay, here if you try to see, there are some examples. First of all, you have to create a service account. What is a service account? Okay, service account is one of the way to authenticate to your cluster. Who will use this particular service account? Service account will be used by your applications. Let's say there is a monitoring tool which is deployed in your cluster. That monitoring tool has to fetch the pod related information or some other information of your cluster. Okay, then what is the best way to give? First of all, One thing we have to understand, not only a user which we are trying to communicate to your Kubernetes cluster, even any application or any application is trying to send some API call, he has to do the authentication and authorization, then only he will be allowed to get the information, right? So to do that by your application, it is better to give a service account. That service account will be used by your application in order to authenticate to your Kubernetes cluster. For that service account, if you apply some proper RBAC rules, automatically he can do that particular actions on the cluster from your application side. So from application side, if you want your access to the cluster, then the best way is to use the service account based authentication, which is nothing but token based authentication. So let's see how to create that. So I'll be creating another namespace, kubectl create namespace. Okay, or else you can use default namespace. Let me try to use default namespace, not a new namespace. Okay, now by default, whenever you create your new namespace or the existing namespace, by default you will have a service account. Okay, let's see that. kubectl get service account SA. You can see, forget about this which we have created for NFS, but you can see this is the default one. If you see in all the namespaces, right now how many namespaces we have, for all the namespaces you will see a default. See default in this namespace, also you will see default in this Tigeri operator, also you will see default namespace, default service account. You can see in cube public also default names, default service account. Okay, and you can see in the cube system also default. Okay, you can see here. So in every namespace you will have this. By default Kubernetes will create it. So let me try to create a new namespace. kubectl create namespace. Okay, let's say so there it's already existed. Okay, DevOps. Done. It is created. Now if you try to fetch the data of your service account in this particular namespace, you will have one. That is nothing but default. So this will be created by default. If you don't want to utilize this, you can create a new one. So how to create another service account? Simple. From CLI it is so easy. Create, okay, service account. Name is nothing but, let's say, for example, I want to give something like say, okay. So this is the service account which I have created. Okay. Now if you see the details, you will have, oh, I created a default namespace. Okay, let me create the same one in DevOps namespace. Okay, I forgot to give the namespace. DevOps. Okay, same another service account name I have created in another namespace. Okay, now if you try to see this, you can see there is another service account. So this service account, what information it will have? That's another question we might have in our mind actually. So that is nothing but it will have a token. So that token will be stored in the form of secrets. Why? Because it is a sensitive information. I told you long back, right, when we discussed about secrets, it can also store sensitive informations like token as well. Okay, so that's the reason Kubernetes by default it will use token. So let's see, describe service account, okay, -n DevOps. Okay, you can see this particular token which is created, name hyphen token hyphen some random number. So kubectl describe, okay, secret slash this particular one hyphen DevOps. Now you can see this particular token. Okay, so this is the token which will be used in order to authenticate to your Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so let's go back. Now this is what we have created already. Okay, no need to worry too much about this. Now we have to create secret is also there, right? I don't need to create at all. Okay, and then I need to create, if you want to create, we have different mechanisms here. Okay, so these are the mechanisms which we have in order to create a secrets. Now anyway we have completed of secreting creating the secret right now. So let us try to give access. Okay, um, yes, so let's try to give this. So what I will do, I'll do some modifications according to our we are discussing about authentication. So do I create any directory? No. So it's okay. Yesterday we stored all our YAML files here, right? DevOps -rback dot YAML. Okay. Here you can see these things you already know. I don't want to re-discuss this particular topics again. Now, additionally, what change you have seen is nothing but here we are declaring the service account. So what is your service account name? There's the one. Okay, and which namespace he is trying to access right now? Any specific namespace you have to tell that. Okay, let's say DevOps it is. Okay, so this is what we are trying to do, and this is a cluster role, so that's the reason I have to specify on which namespace it should apply. Okay, done. Now let's save this and come out. Okay, there is no deny rules. Okay, whatever you will allow, only those actions you can perform. If you want to deny some actions, you no need to declare it. Okay, so do remember that we don't have any deny rules in this particular role or a cluster role. Okay, if you want to allow, if you want to give the permissions, you have to declare here. So simple it is. Okay, now let's save this. So everything is done. Okay, so this will come out. Now kubectl create -f and oops, rback. So this is created right now. So I created a service account, and for that service account I have declared my role and cluster role, role and role binding as well. Now what I need to do, I need to add the entries to my configmap file. So how to add this particular entries into the configmap file right now? So simple it is. First of all, you have to decode your token. So that is what we have to do first. So let's try to do that now. Here I need to do some modifications. Actually, let's try to do. We copy this. So go back to this terminal of your control plane. Yeah. Now if you try to recall, this is your secret, right? So when you are pasting this, you have to replace your token with that service account token. What is that? Okay, so this will decode actually. What happened? Oh, so it is not in default namespace, it is in DevOps namespace. Okay, you can see it is decoded. Actually, you can take this one as it is. This is nothing but a non-decoded one. Okay, non-decoded one. You can directly take this one. Okay, but anyway, using this particular command, right, that will print only a token related information. Okay, so that is what we are trying to do right now. Okay, so this information is needed, and what is another information that we need? Certificate related information. So let's try to execute that. Why these two informations are needed? Because we are trying to do a token based authentication. Okay, it's like DevOps. Is a certificate. Okay, so these two informations are needed for us in order to add the entries of this particular user to that particular DevOps namespace to authenticate and authorize. Okay, so now how will you add the entries into your config map file from CLI? So simple it is. Just take this command. Let's modify according to our requirement. So now I just want to mention like, what is your token? Just take it and copy paste. till here it is. Okay, done. Credentials are done. Okay, so if you execute kubectl config show, sorry, config view, you can see the entry has been added, but there is no CA certificate, CA information which is added, the certificate. Okay, so let me try to add that particular certificate related information. So where is my certificate actually? Take this. So let me try to open the file, config file. So client key data. Okay, so just I need to paste it. Done. Okay, so now save this file and come out. Okay, so the entire information has been added. Now I need to add the context. So just execute this command, but let us try to do modification because this is not the one. So I need to do the modification. User is this. Okay, in which namespace you need to access? DevOps. Okay, and this is the cluster which we already have. So let me try to modify this to a user. Done. Now we have totally 3 contexts, right? So get context. You can see now. So this context is also available right now and is only able to access DevOps namespace. Okay. So this is what we have declared right now. So now if I want to switch to that particular context right now, so kubectl, let's try to see that. Config use hyphen context. Okay. Done. Now if you execute kubectl get nodes, it doesn't work. But if you try to give kubectl get pods, it works. You can see the forbidden of the user. It is telling that system dot service account dot that namespace and the service account name cannot list the resource nodes in the API group at the cluster scope. Okay, so that is clearly mentioned like that. But pod related information you can fetch. Okay, but if you try to create a pod, will it allow me or not? Let's see. So kubectl. Okay, let me try to create one pod. Okay, so for that what I can do, kubectl run, okay, hyphen d, so I can only to mention this, run test hyphen pod, okay, and then hyphen image is equal to nginx, and then hyphen namespace DevOps. Okay, so let's try to create this. I'm allowed to create. You can see I was allowed to create this particular resource. Okay, now let me try to delete this. kubectl delete pod test hyphen pod. You can see forbidden. I was not allowed to delete this. Now in order to come out of this particular issue, what I can do is nothing but let me switch to the user admin context, and I will do the modifications into my roles. Okay, so what is a role I just want to modify? kubectl edit role. Okay, it is created in DevOps namespace, right? So what is the name of that I have allocated? Let me try to. Okay, so the name which I gave is nothing but this one. Okay, so let's take this. Okay, in which namespace? DevOps, right? Now it is open. Now what I will try to do is nothing but for pods you can get, create and list, but there is no action of delete. Instead of that I will give full permissions. See now how I will do it. Okay, done. Let's save this and come out. Now you are done the modifications. Okay, now let us switch back to that particular context. Okay, now if I try to execute the command called delete pod, now it should delete. Okay, you can do whatever actions you want right now for pods, deployments and daemon sets, whatever the objects you have given the actions, you can perform on all of them. Okay, so in this way we can modify the permissions at any point of time. If you have access to do the permission to modify the roles and cluster roles and all, you can immediately open in the edit format, do the modifications and then apply the changes. Okay, so these are the things which we can modify on the fly itself. Okay, so this is all about your cluster role and cluster role binding with service account. So these topics are important. So I'll be sharing the video about username password based authentication using Keystone of OpenStack cloud component, open source component, in order to integrate to your Kubernetes cluster for username password based authentication. Okay, that I will be sharing on the next video by today itself, and you can watch that particular video how to integrate that particular component. Okay, so if you are using any cloud like AWS or Azure and all, Azure can already you can integrate this particular Active Directory of their Azure Active Directory to your existing Kubernetes cluster, AKS. So that can be done because they are providing the integration. But when you are doing on premises, you have to do it on your own. Okay. So how to do that? So this is one of the tool which we are using in order to integrate. Okay. So similarly, we have so many other tools like OpenID, OAuth 2, second version actually. Okay, so we can integrate so many other tools as well to your Kubernetes cluster for authentication. Okay, authorization, again we are relying on RBAC policies of your Kubernetes. That is the best way of setting up the authorization. Okay, so next topics will be on scheduling, horizontal pod auto scaling, ingress controller and then network policy. Okay,